Hey everyone out there in internet land, it's your old pal Mike Radich, and today we're going to be talking about why Nick Newell will never fight in the UFC. Now, I know what you're thinking, well, duh, Mike, we know, Dana White said so. Dana White put out a statement saying that Nick Newell wasn't going to be a part of the UFC, but these are the real reasons why Nick Newell won't be fighting inside the octagon. I know Dana White put out that statement, but he didn't really dive deep into it. He just gave a generic statement. But these are the real reasons why Nick Newell will never fight in the UFC. Now, before we get going, I have to say that I'm a fan of Nick Newell. I know that this is a negative video towards him, but it's not meant to be. I'm just giving you the reasons why the UFC won't allow him to fight in the UFC, why the UFC won't be giving him that opportunity going forward. It's not negative towards him. I'm a fan of his. I know a lot of people out there are a fan of his. I know there's a huge market for him fighting in MMA, so I'm hoping that he'll go back to the drawing board, he'll go back to the regional circuit, and he'll pick up some wins, he'll get back on a win streak and give this another shot. Maybe right now isn't the right time. We've seen this before where Dana White has said never to this person and that person, but then as time goes on, he starts to change his mind. So maybe he might change his mind and give Nick Newell a shot in the UFC, or give him another shot on the Contender Series. Maybe in the future that will happen. So I hope he goes back to the regional circuit, picks up some wins, and keeps trying. And I hope he keeps fighting. I don't want to see him retire. But with that said, here's the reasons why Nick Newell will never fight in the UFC. There's two big reasons, and they go hand in hand. The first reason is history, and the second reason is the media. Now stick with me, because eventually, as this video goes on, these two will mesh together. But let's start with history, because this has happened before. The UFC has been pressured by fans who like a guy and want to see him fight inside the octagon. The fans pressure the UFC into giving this fighter a shot. This has happened before, and I give you two really good examples. The first example is Kimbo Slice. The second example is Antonio McKee. Now, sometimes the UFC gets pressured into putting guys into a certain situation because other fighters will stick up for them, managers will stick up for them, fans will stick up for them. People will want to see certain guys fight in the UFC. Now, the perfect examples are those two guys I mentioned, Kimbo Slice and Antonio McKee. Two totally different reasons why they were allowed to fight in the UFC. Kimbo Slice was this guy who had this cult following. He had a lot of people who were curious in seeing him fight in the UFC. McKee, on the other hand, was a guy who a lot of people thought was really, really boring, had a big mouth. A lot of people didn't like him. They wanted to see him inside the octagon so he would get humbled by someone who was fighting in the UFC, because at the time, McKee was the MFC lightweight champion, and he was beating guys left and right. He was handling them, but he wasn't finishing these guys, and he wasn't being exciting in these fights. And he was telling everyone how he can beat BJ Penn and how he was the greatest lightweight in the world, and he could beat, Kenny Florian and Diego Sanchez and all these guys who were the top contenders in the UFC lightweight division during the time that he was the MFC lightweight champion. So people wanted to see him inside the UFC so that he would get humbled. And the same thing goes for what the UFC management wanted. Joe Silva couldn't stand Antonio McKee. This goes back many, many years. Antonio McKee had been trying to get into the UFC for a very long time. He was campaigning to get his shot in the UFC when Jens Pulver was the UFC bantamweight champion. This predates the lightweight division. Back when Antonio McKee was campaigning to get a shot in the UFC had 4 weight classes. They had heavyweight, middleweight, lightweight, and bantamweight. So Jens Pulver was the UFC bantamweight champion during the time that Antonio McKee was trying to get Joe Silva to give him a shot. He's like, hey, I can beat this guy. I can be the champion. And you're too boring. Your style's not that great. You don't sell tickets. You don't do anything that we're really looking for. We're trying to really build this company, and McKee couldn't even get in. So finally they give McKee his shot, and they match him up horribly. They match him up with a guy who's younger, faster, and stronger than him, and has the exact same style. So Jacob Volkman, who fought against Antonio McKee, knows exactly what McKee is going to do. He knows when he's going to do it, he knows how he's going to do it, and he knows why he's going to do it. So McKee doesn't win the fight, and Jacob Volkman is a gatekeeper at lightweight. The UFC's not a fan of him either. He just did a solid to the organization because the UFC was trying to get rid of McKee. Hey, we gave you this shot, you didn't do it, now you're gone. And McKee only fought one time in the UFC. The UFC's done that before. When they get a guy who they're not 100% sold on or a guy they don't like, they give him a matchup that's very, very tough for them. And if they win the fight, then the UFC will give them another opportunity and they'll be somewhat more excited about the idea of them staying around in the organization long term. McKee lost that fight, so now he's dismissed. Nick Newell lost his fight, now he's dismissed. Hey, we gave this guy a shot, we wanted to see how he was going to do. He didn't do well, so okay, now he's gone. Same thing with Kimbo Slice. Kimbo Slice, they did the same thing to him. They weren't sold on him, but the fans were behind him. They wanted to see how he would do inside the octagon, and the UFC gave him a shot. They gave him 3 shots, actually. One was on the Ultimate Fighter against Roy Nelson. That was a very tough matchup, but that has an asterisk next to it because Team Rashad just was trying to take out who they thought was the worst guy on Team Rampage during Season 10 of The Ultimate Fighter. Rashad Evans was trying to win that show, so he put his best guy, Roy Nelson, against the guy he thought was the worst guy on Team Rampage, and that would be Kimbo Slice, R.I.P. So that wasn't done as part of a bigger plan. The Houston Alexander fight and the Matt Mitrione fight, those fights were put together as part of this bigger plan of, hey, we don't want this guy, but if he can beat guys who we think are better than him, then we'll be sold on the idea of him sticking around long term. And that's what happened with Nick Newell. They went out and they found a guy who was a bad matchup for him and was really, really tough. And they did it in a certain way that they gave him someone who was similar in experience to him. Same way they did with Kimbo. They gave him Matt Mitrione, who was similar in experience to him. Yes, Matt Mitrione is a horrible matchup for Kimbo Slice. He's bigger, faster, and stronger, and more athletic than Kimbo. And he's a true heavyweight. I always thought that Kimbo Slice, if he lost some weight, he could be a really, really good-sized 205er. He's a smaller heavyweight in that Fedor mold. And Matt Mitrione is a very tough matchup for those guys who are that size. So he fights Matt Mitrione, he loses, and now the UFC abandons him. The same way they're abandoning Nick Newell. They know that the guy they gave him is a very tough matchup, but they had to do it because, well, if he can do it, then, okay, he's proven that he belongs here. He has this fan base. He has all these people pushing for him. If he can win this fight, then, all right, he's sold us on the idea of fighting. Now, where the media and the history all blends together is because this sport is very difficult to cover because you have to be part historian all the time. You know, everything that you're saying has to have something with history because everything really in this sport, if you really break it down step by step, everything ties back to something that happened in the past. Every fighter's record is a story, and everything that happened in that fighter's history can sometimes creep back into the present day. So history is really important in this sport because history always repeats itself in MMA. Those 2 stories that I just told you about, the one about Antonio McKee and the one about Kimbo Slice, that just happened in the form of Nick Newell. That's why it's very, very difficult to cover this sport because you always have to have a little bit of history in the back of your mind at all times because everyone's freaking out about this Nick Newell story, but I just told you 2 stories where the exact same thing happened to those guys. Now, their situations were different. All 3 of these guys have very different stories, but the way the UFC went about giving these guys an opportunity and then dismissing them when they didn't pass the test, it's all the same. So that's why the media is tied into this, because the media doesn't always remember history, or the media doesn't always care about history. And that's why the UFC had to do what they did. Because, okay, let's go down the list of the media members that are in the mainstream that would be talking about this Nick Newell story if something was to go wrong. Now, if the UFC had given Nick Newell an opportunity to fight on, let's say, a UFC pay-per-view or a Fox Sports 1 card that was a part of a UFC pay-per-view or a Fox Sports 1 main card or a Big Fox main card or an undercard of a Fox or whatever, wherever they would have put him on a card. Let's say that they would have done that, because the two main reasons why the UFC put Nick Newell on the Dana White Tuesday Night Contender Series on UFC Fight Pass is because if he were to lose in a violent fashion, they could easily bury it, because technically Nick Newell never got a chance to fight in the UFC. People are saying, oh, well, they put him on the Contender Series, that was his shot. Well, technically, no. Technically, he never got a shot in the UFC because they award UFC contracts to the guys who impress them on the Contender Series. So technically, he's never fought in the UFC. He's never gotten that opportunity to fight in the UFC. Yes, the fights take place in front of Dana White, who's the president of the UFC. Yes, the fights take place in the Octagon. Yes, the fights take place at the Tough Gym. But he didn't get the shot in the UFC. Those aren't UFC fights. Those are fights to give you the opportunity to earn a contract so that you can fight in the UFC. So the UFC did that because if he were to lose, they could easily say, oh, well, we never put that on our thing. The Contender Series is a different thing. It's not a UFC event. It's just something separate. It's just a tryout. It's just an opportunity to try to get into the UFC. There's no guarantees that even if you do win and look impressive that you'll get that shot. So the UFC can easily bury that by putting that on there. The second thing is, okay, if he were to win, if he was to go in there and destroy whoever the UFC put in front of him, and then let's say, okay, he wins that fight, he earns his shot in the UFC gives him a fight, and things go wrong. He goes in, he gets knocked out in under 60 seconds. The media just goes insane. All these know-nothings, guys who don't have a frickin' clue of MMA. You got guys like Skip Bayless who still think that Nate Diaz won the first fight he had against Conor McGregor because of sumo wrestling.
Got him on the ground. It's called wrestling, sumo-style wrestling, and he just pinned him. He pinned him. Sumo-style wrestling, sumo-style wrestling, sumo-style wrestling.
Guys like Nick Wright, who don't know the difference between a crowbar and an armbar.
Stay in your lane.
Colin Cowherd.
Stay in your lane.
Jason Whitlock.
I don't think he can comment on anything but snacks.
Stephen A. Smith, Max Kellerman, Will Kane.
Stay in your lane.
All these guys who don't know anything about MMA, these Johnny-come-lately guys, these guys who only care about MMA because their boss told them they have to talk about it.
Sumo-style wrestling?
These guys who only talk about MMA because they're forced to. These guys who never, ever, ever would watch the UFC just for enjoyment, just for fun. These guys who only watch the UFC or only watch MMA because they're forced to. These guys have no interest in the sport whatsoever.
Sumo-style wrestling, and he just pinned him. He pinned him.
These are the guys who would be commenting on the, a fight where something would happen bad to Nick Newell. This guy goes in there, he has this one arm, he gets knocked out. The media would have a field day with this. How could the UFC let this happen? How could they put this guy in there? The UFC can't allow that to happen. They had to put him on the Contender Series because then they would have something to say, okay, this is why. We put him through this thing. We put several fighters through this thing we call the Dana White Tuesday Contender Series. He proved himself there, and that's why we gave him the opportunity to jump into the UFC. They had to save their own butts by doing this. All right, we'll put him on the Contender Series. If he does well, then that will grant him the opportunity to fight in the UFC so that these know-nothings, these guys like Shannon Sharp and all these other guys who don't have a clue about MMA, they won't say anything.
Got him on the ground. It's called wrestling, sumo-style wrestling.
That's where media and history collide. It's because, okay, the UFC couldn't put Nick Newell right off the bat in a real, true UFC fight on a fight night card or a pay-per-view card or a Fox card, whatever. They couldn't do that because if he were to lose, people would be going nuts. People would be saying, how could you let this happen? The UFC had to do it this way. They had no choice because all these people would be coming out of the woodwork. I've seen some people online say, oh, well, Nick Newell's a real fighter. Like, they should have given him a real shot in the UFC. Like, he's a real fighter. He's really good. you're saying that, I'm saying that, I'm saying he's a great fighter, you're saying he's a great fighter, we're all on the same team here. We're all in agreement that he's a really great fighter, but you have to go with these media guys who don't know anything. And these guys know way more, and they know absolutely nothing than mainstream media news, entertainment news, regular news, local news. These people would also be covering this story if the UFC let a guy in there with one arm and he got knocked out. Everyone would be having a field day. Dana White would have to be defending himself left and right. It would just be terrible. We all know that he's a great fighter, but the mainstream sports media and the mainstream regular media don't know his track record. That's why history and media need to go hand in hand, because these guys aren't historians about the sport. There's guys who cover this sport for a living, only cover MMA, that don't have a freaking clue about this sport. And you're going to expect guys like Skip Bayless and Stephen A. Smith and Nick Wright to know what the hell's going on?
Stay in your lane.
Absolutely not. So, because that's in place, you can't use the defense of, well, he fought great competition before. He fought for the world title and won a world title in XFC. You can't use that because the mainstream media and mainstream sports media don't know what the hell XFC is. They never saw that fight. They don't know how that fight went down. They're not going to care enough. The media is very, very dishonest. They're not going to care enough to go out and search for the truth and look at this guy's record and see the guys he's fought. They're not going to do that, so you can't use that as a defense. You can't say, oh, well, he fought for the world title against Justin Gaethje, one of the best lightweights in the world, a very, very tough guy, a very, very skilled guy. You can't use that as a defense because, A, no one knows what the hell World Series of Fighting is. No one watched that fight. Yes, it was on regular NBC, big NBC. It was a really big fight for the promotion at that time, but World Series of Fighting doesn't exist anymore. Yes, it turned into PFL. Some of the people who were running it, Ray Sefo, Carlos Silva, some of those guys are still around, but it's a new organization now. It's not World Series of Fighting anymore. So when people hear World Series of Fighting, they don't know what that is. So you can't use that as a defense. You can't say, oh, well, he fought against Justin Gaethje, he's fought against some tough guys. These people only think that MMA is the UFC, so you can't convince them that, oh, well, he fought against tough guys in the past, so it's okay to let him fight tough guys in the future. You can't do that because these people don't understand the history of this sport. That's why this sport is very, very difficult to cover, because you constantly have to have the balance of current events and history, because they always mesh together. And right now this is meshing together. You can't use the defense of he fought tough guys in the past, because the mainstream media and the people who are going to be commenting on this don't know anything about these guys. Oh, well, so-and-so's a really tough guy. But if these people have never heard of him, like if Nick Newell fought against Conor McGregor and beat Conor McGregor, then people would never say anything if in his next fight he got knocked out. No one would even care because everyone knows Conor McGregor. You can't talk about these tough guys that he fought that no one knows, and you can't talk about where he fought because no one knows anything about these organizations. So the UFC had to do what they did because they had to make sure that if something did go wrong, that they could just bury it. So that's why they put him on the Contender Series. And that's why Nick Newell is never fighting in the UFC. It's because media doesn't understand anything about this sport, and because of the history and the past that the UFC's done in situations like this. That's why Nick Newell's never fighting in the UFC. It's very, very sad. The guy has a ton of skill, a ton of heart. You know, when he locks on a submission, you're done. Watch that fight that he had against Eric Reynolds when he claimed the XFC lightweight title. Eric Reynolds was done. The minute he slapped on that choke, Nick Newell had him. It was just an amazing performance. It's very sad that he's not getting that shot, but I'd like to see him continue. I want to see him keep fighting. I'm just telling you why it happened. I'm just giving you the reasons why Nick Newell isn't going to be fighting in the UFC. I'm not trying to bash the guy or whatever. I'm just telling you the reasons why. And this is not me criticizing anyone. I'm not criticizing the UFC. I'm not criticizing him. I'm just giving you the facts. And the facts are, because we don't have educated people in the right spots to cover this sport, it's affecting guys' opportunities moving forward. Yes, as the UFC pushes to try and get more and more mainstream, as they try to be a part of the sports diet, with that, you need people who know the business. You need people that know the history of the sport. You need people that know the history of the fighters to be commenting on this, because people watch Skip Bayless. People watch Nick Wright. People watch Colin Cowherd. People believe what these guys are selling, because a lot of people don't have time to do the research on their own. You're a guy, you're working 40, 50 hours. You got your family, you got other hobbies. You're not going to go and do a deep dive into the history of MMA. You're just not going to do that. You're not going to have time. You're going to trust guys who have been branded by a network as someone who knows something about the sport. You're going to listen to that guy. So when you're hearing this stuff, you as the fan who, maybe is just a casual fan, or a guy who's trying to get into the sport, or someone who just shows up when there's big fights happening, or someone who's got a friend who's a fan of the sport, and you're trying to, get something that you guys can talk about together, you're going to trust these guys who are branded by these networks to be telling you the truth, and they're just not going to do it because they're not doing their homework. So that's why Nick Newell got into this problem. Yes, as we keep pushing forward and forward with mainstream, you can't have situations that will make a media circus out of it, because you won't have the right people in the right places defending this. You put me in there with Skip Bayless, I'll make Skip Bayless look foolish.
He would need help. I'm too big, too strong. I'm undefeated, never lost.
But they're not going to put me on there. They're going to put some other guy like Shannon Sharp on there he doesn't have any idea about the business. He has no clue who any of these fighters are. He doesn't know anything about what's going on inside the business. So that's really what's hurting Nick Newell, and it's really unfair. But the bottom line is, it's risk versus reward. If the risk is high, the reward better be as high, if not higher, than the risk. Obviously, the UFC felt that Nick Newell's reward was way lower than the risk. And that's sad, but that's the truth.
It's called wrestling, sumo-style wrestling.